All right, welcome everyone. Today we are going to be talking about image textures. So last video we talked about textures that are built into Blender. Let's take a quick look at those again. Notice too that I've got three objects that I've brought into my scene for today's demo. I've got a sphere, a cube, and a cylinder. And we're going to look at how image textures work differently on these three different objects. So let's take a look real quick at the type of textures built into Blender. We've got wood, voxel, Voronoi, Stucky, point density, ocean, noise, and some others. Most of these create a predetermined pattern. So for example, if I add clouds to my cube and then I render, I end up with this cloudy texture on my cube. And we've seen ways that we can make this cloud texture more 3D. We can change the color of the cloud texture, and that's all well and good. But what if we want a more high resolution texture? What if we want to use something that appears a bit more realistic and has a lot more detail? For that, we can use something called an image texture, which I'm going to show you guys today. So an image texture is basically a image that we are going to apply as a texture on top of our material. Now, as always, notice that all three of these guys, if I switch to my materials tab, all three of these guys already have a material because we have to have a material before we can before we are able to apply any textures. And for built-in textures, we can control the color of the pattern, the color of the material, and it all affects the look. The important thing about image textures is that the color of the object doesn't matter. So if I'm going to put an image on my sphere, and I make the sphere blue or green or yellow, the image is just going to cover it up. It's not actually going to be affected by the colors that I choose. So don't worry so much about what the material looks like, or what the material's color is, the diffuse color. Just know that whatever it is, it's going to get covered up by our texture. And so I'm going to show you guys a website real quick. I've already downloaded a couple of textures, but I'm going to show you guys where I like to get my textures from in Blender. This website is called opengameart.org/textures. And OpenGameArt is really great because all of the images here are free to use. You guys can use them in your Blender animations and sculptures however you see fit, and there's a whole bunch of categories. So I've already downloaded a couple of stone ones. I'm going to go to Fire and Lava, and I'm going to choose, how about this lava texture? And then I'm going to download it by clicking where it says the name of the file. So in this case, it's fire.jpg, and I'm going to save that to my computer. Okay, so let's look at how we apply these image textures to our various objects. I'm going to start with the cube. So just like with a regular texture, I'm going to go to the Textures tab, and I need to change the type to image or movie. So image or movie is going to allow me to select an image file that it's going to wrap around this cube as a texture. Now, a lot of these things about textures that we were considering before, we're not going to have to worry about, but projections are still something that we want to make sure we do well. So we're going to have to change projections just like we did before. I'm going to open my, let's see if I can find it here. That's not what I want. Here we go. So I'm going to add some bricks. Open image. Now we can see whoever made this texture didn't do a good job of making the texture what's called seamless. You can see in this preview right here that we can see where the picture ends and the picture begins. Normally we wouldn't want that, but for our example today, I'm going to work with this image. So let's see what happens if I render. Okay, so on top, the bricks look good, but notice that the side looks really messed up. That's because we're not taking into account our projection. Right now, our coordinate projection is set to flat, which is why the top looks good, because it's laying the image flat over the top of our mesh, but it ends up getting stretched down the sides. So rather than flat, we want cube. And now if we render, we get a nice brick cube. So what about some of the other settings that we talked about before? Remember that last class we said that geometry makes our texture look 3D. So what happens if I apply normal geometry to an image texture? Well, Blender actually does a pretty good job of detecting where the differences in the texture are and then making it more rough. So you can see that now where all of the little seams between the bricks are, it looks a little bit more 3D. And if we wanted to increase that even more, we could bump this guy up further to 5. Let's see what that looks like. So it's starting to look a little bit more shiny, which we don't really want, but it is giving depth to our bricks. So normal geometry is something that is pretty effective across the board. I'm going to keep mine like that for now. So notice, though, that none of the coloring, none of this pink, none of the gray or the white diffuse color are showing through. The image completely takes over our object. So let's add a couple others. I'm going to go to my sphere because I want to demonstrate a couple different projections. I am going to go to my texture tab and add a texture. And notice that the default texture is image or movie. So by default, Blender is having me use an image texture. I'm going to open rock. We're going to make a rock texture for this one. There is my rock texture. And let's take a look at what my rock texture looks like. Okay, pretty weird. So, once again, we probably have a projection issue. And if we see here, we want our coordinates, we look at our notes, we want our coordinates to be generated, and we want our projection to match our shape. So I'm going to go to generated, then I'm going to change the projection to sphere, because this should be a sphere. And now let's render it. Okay, now we've got a little bit closer to what we want. We've got this rocky texture, but it looks pretty smooth. So I'm going to fix that just by checking normal geometry again. Now if we render, I've got this pretty good looking stone texture that wraps around my sphere and makes it look like if I were to touch it, it would actually be rough. So we got two good textures going here, and we noticed that we had to switch cube and sphere based on the projection. Let's try one more. Let's create our cylinder of fire. And for our cylinder, I'm actually going to do some auto smoothing so that the top looks good. I'm going to auto smooth at 90 degrees. So it flattens out the top there. We should know auto smoothing by now. We've used it a few times in class. And I'm going to add in the textures tab an image to this guy as well. And I'm going to open the last image that we downloaded. So our fire image. And let's check it out. Now, as you've probably guessed, our coordinates and projection are going to be wrong. So this isn't going to look right, but let's see what happens. All right, again, totally messed up. So the first thing you guys should look at when you see a stretched out texture like this is your coordinates and projection. I would be willing to bet that in any scenario where your texture doesn't look right, it's probably a projection problem. So let's go generated, and let's go tube, right? This is pretty tube shaped. So let's see what that does for us. Now we can see we have this flame here. But let's say I want the flame to be bigger or smaller. One of the other things that we have in our texture is the size property. And size just determines how many times the picture is going to repeat. Now, what's a little backwards about this is if we change the size to something bigger, the image is actually going to look smaller. So larger size means smaller image. So if I want my image to be twice as small, right here where it says size, I'm going to double the size for each of my x, y, and z values. So now if I render, my flames appear smaller. It's making the image repeat more times in a single area. If I wanted it to be 5 times smaller than the original, I'd make these all 5, and then try it again. Now everything's getting really tiny. I can start to see patterns where the fire is repeating. So I'm going to put them back to 2. I think 2 looks pretty good. But notice that, again, the pink's not affecting, the diffuse color's not affecting, the texture, image texture totally takes over. So let's see what this looks like with normal geometry. All right, here we've got something that looks pretty weird because normal geometry is only based on the colors that Blender sees. So sometimes normal geometry really isn't what we want, but if we're looking for something rough, then usually normal geometry will give us that. And we could play with all these settings, and I encourage you guys to. We have specular and diffuse values here. There's also some shading values that determine how the light plays against our image. So check these out. But keep in mind that normal geometry is really good for these rough effects. All right, and that's all there is to image textures. As long as you can find the image and you can choose the right projection, we always want generated, and then we want to pick a mapping based on the shape of our object. As long as we can do that, then we have our image texture. In the next video, I'm going to show you guys how to partition the lighthouse apart so we can give the lighthouse a stonework column, but it'll be separate from the stone of our balcony and our roof and our glass top. All right, thanks for watching.